Good morning. Good morning. I hope everybody had a chance to grab some coffee, to have some breakfast, to tell stories from last night and yesterday's events. I know I had a wonderful, wonderful time in the breakout sessions yesterday and in the dinner reception last night, and hope that you all did too. Great. Okay. So we have another exciting day ahead of us. And I've spent some time reflecting this morning. And one of the things that I felt as I was going through the breakout sessions and having a lot of the conversations with many of you was just an immense sense of gratitude for all the time that everybody was spending to put into those conversations and to really bring yourself to those conversations and bring ideas and solutions and real obstacles and impediments that you all face, because I think that that's really what gets us to the heart of what we're trying to achieve. And it also really connected me back to something that Director Sam Asefa had said at the very beginning of this process. And Director Asefa is both my boss at the Office of Planning and Research, as well as the chair of the SGC Council. And when we were really thinking about this idea at the very beginning, he gave us really, really clear direction. He said, I want you to focus equity, clarity, and innovation in everything that you're doing as you're creating and thinking through the strategy for this event. And I hope that that's what you're feeling and seeing. I feel like there were a lot of themes around clarity and inclusion and how we get to solutions in a way that makes the most sense for the community that we're seeking to serve. I also wanted to thank the council members for all of the work that they have gone into preparing for this event and the leadership that it took to get to this point. So we have two council members who have been with us for these two events. So Council Member Frank Cardenas, if you could stand up and wave. Thank you. And then I haven't seen him this morning, but is Rohan Radhakrishna here to this morning? Maybe not yet, but he was here all of yesterday. And so in absentia, please join me in thanking him for all the time that he spent with us yet as well. And then also for those who are on the key staff, could I also ask you to stand as well? Now, the key staff is an incredibly important part of how the Strategic Growth Council works. Oh. 9 o'clock is early, guys. I know. We had, I think, almost the entire key staff was here yesterday, and I think we'll see them as we continue forward and it gets a little bit later in the day. But the key staff form a really important role in the council where they serve each agency secretary as their lead representative in a lot of the conversations that we have as we're working forward on initiatives, ideas. And it is the most incredible sounding board, leadership board that you could imagine. And they really help us think through intersectionality, coordination, and communication in a way that's really important. So thank you to the key staff and the council and Director Asefa for all that you have done. Now, it gives me just incredible joy to welcome our first speaker for today. So Lauren Sanchez, who has over a decade of experience in tackling the climate crises from government, academic, and nonprofit roles at the global, national, and local levels. She currently serves as Governor Newsom's Senior Advisor for Climate and most recently served as Senior Advisor to Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry. And prior to joining the Biden-Harris administration, she was Deputy Secretary for Climate Policy and Intergovernmental Relations at the California Environmental Protection Agency and International Policy Director for the California Air Resources Board from 2017 to 2021. I also understand that she's pretty good at karaoke and just learned that she also plays point guard in basketball. So please join me in welcoming Lauren Sanchez.
No karaoke this morning, but maybe over lunch. All right, good morning, buenos dias. Thank you so much for having me, Lynn. Thank you for the warm introduction, and thank you to all the organizers of today's event. I have the great privilege of serving as Governor Newsom's Senior Climate Advisor And today, the distinct honor of being the warm-up for Mayor Villagrosa, who I know you're all very excited to listen to today. I wanted to cover three things. First, how I got here, and secondly, what we're working on now in the governor's office on climate and equity, and then thirdly, how we move forward together. So when my father came here from Mexico, he was raised in LA in Boyle Heights. There were many days when he couldn't go outside during recess because of the smog. He lived between two highways near what are now orphan wells, and in a neighborhood that was really a poster child for environmental injustice in our state. He came chasing the California dream, and I consider myself very much a product of that. But what keeps me up at night is that dream feels like it's slipping away. Now there are too many students who can't go outside because of wildfire smoke. We know that pollution disparities and inequities exist across the state, and that the task ahead of us is immense and most days very intimidating. I took a class in college that focused on social movements, where we studied apartheid and Gandhi and the civil rights movement. And on the last day of the semester, my professor said, the next social movement of your generation is climate change. And that has been my North Star since leaving college. I've spent, as Lynn covered, the last decade of my career really focused on this issue, and really trying in each of my roles in public service to break climate change out of an environmental issue and really emphasize that it is a social justice issue. It's an economic justice issue. And for my generation and many of us in the audience, it is an existential crisis for our future. So I went and first worked on this issue from a global perspective, the international agreements, where, looking back on it, the UN is so detached from what's actually happening on the ground. I then went to the federal government level, where you start to feel a little bit closer to the people that are actually impacted by this crisis. But it was really in coming to California that I feel like I had my eyes open to the impact and transformative power that comes with really partnering with communities. And, I was drawn to the state because of our ambition and climate goals. But what kept me here is really the focus on communities and the track record of partnering with community leaders across the state. And it was that same ethos that really led to our transformative climate budget last year. I sat down with the governor, and when I first came to California, we were spending a couple $100 million every year on climate investments broadly. And he said, we have a historic opportunity, once in a generation budget surplus, to really unleash what could become the next revolution on climate change. Lauren, what does that look like? And if you look back at the transformative moments in California history, we do have this unique ability to drive social and cultural change, whether it's biotech or aerospace or even Hollywood. And he said we need to create that same revolution on climate, but this time lead with equity. We know that tackling climate change can deliver economic opportunity for all. People often say that tackling climate change is the greatest economic opportunity since the Industrial Revolution. But California has gotten it wrong in the past, and we need to be very intentional and make sure that that economic opportunity is first and foremost delivered to those communities on the front lines of the crisis and on the front lines of pollution. And so I sat down with 12, point guard. I sat down with 12 different cabinet secretaries, our environmental parts of the administration, but also our education partners, our housing partners, transportation and workforce development, and said, what would it look like to invest in your agency and departments in a way that helps the climate agenda, but really pushes economic opportunity for all Californians? And I was so proud last year to unveil the budget and then partner with the legislature and so many of you in this room on that multi-billion-dollar, multi-year commitment that is not only the investments in ZEVs and the investment in clean energy, but hundreds of millions of dollars into innovation, workforce opportunities, climate health, climate homes. We know that tackling climate change means affordable housing and accessible transit and good jobs and an education where our students aren't feeling climate despair because they can't go outside and recess in wildfire smoke. Instead, they're feeling empowered to be a part of the solution. And in each of the packages, we first and foremost led with equity. So if you look at our ZEV package, it's about incentives for communities of color and low-income Californians to get into cleaner cars and shared transit. If you look at building decarbonization, again, really targeting those funds. And if this is starting to sound familiar, a lot of it was birthed out of the Green New Deal and the Transformative Climate Communities program here in California. We looked at what was working in communities across the state and basically tried to scale it to be statewide. That said, we have proposed a few budget cuts given the fiscal and economic forecast for the state. The governor's proposing to retain about 90% of that climate budget. But importantly, we did not reduce any of the investments in health and education and workforce development. And as you'll hear Mayor Villaraigosa talk about, we're hoping to augment those cuts with all of the federal funding that is hopefully coming into this, that continues to come into the state, along with other creative ideas. One of the things we were most proud of last year, 2022, really being a banner year for climate in California, was not only this budget and California's version of the Green New Deal, but a legislative package that, again, tried to make sure our climate policies are embedding equity across the board, for the first time establishing setbacks for oil and gas drilling from daycares and homes and schools, progress on offshore wind and zero emission vehicles and nature-based solutions. And something that we don't lift up often enough, but I'm hoping will be a catalyst for action this year, is really finally tackling some of the barriers that we have heard from communities in terms of accessing the funding. So what does it mean that the state is spending $48 billion on this crisis if communities feel like there are too many barriers to know where the funding is and to access it? I gather this is a big topic of discussion over the 2 days, so I'm excited to listen and take back some ideas. But one of the key things we worked on with the legislature was advanced payment and making sure that we're not working in a reimbursement model here in the state, but for those programs that are most focused on communities, we can make sure advanced pay is an option. And when I look at the track record of the state, we talk about the cap and trade program, the greenhouse gas reduction fund, that has raised over $20 billion to date. Over half of that has benefited our priority populations across the state. We have statutory minimums that, every year we hope to exceed. And as you all know, that was a big part of inspiration for the federal government adopting Justice 40. And we're very excited to continue to partner with them in terms of what we've learned here in California on how you target those funds to the populations that need them most, including things like addressing advanced payment. But I want to shift to looking forward. There are, in this job and in this line of work, I think climate despair affects us all. And it was a tough January for a lot of us here in the state, and for too many communities around the state. But there are 3 big things that, looking forward, I'm excited to partner with you all on, and that do give me that sense of hope. The first is Mayor Villaraigosa, where'd he go? And his incredible team, making sure that the state is putting its best foot forward and leaning into all federal funding opportunities. Of course, a lot of those coming to the state directly, and we know we can't just be a pass-through to projects. We need to be very intentional about how we are helping everyone in this room and around the state access that funding. And the Inflation Reduction Act, really a once-in-a-generation historic opportunity to make sure that these technologies and solutions are benefiting all Californians. The second really is that the budget I articulated at the opening, the climate and opportunity frame. Those dollars are going out the door right now. And I'll give you all my email address. If you don't know how to access them, I'm committed to making sure that Californians know not only how to access them, but how the funds are benefiting their community. My job isn't about transforming the climate. It's about transforming communities and how Californians live in this state. And then lastly, Lynn, I'm so glad you asked SGC members to stand. I think everyone in this room who has worked for SGC or OPR or partnered with SGC, the incredible work you all are doing really on the front lines of this issue, pushing us to innovate around solutions, pushing us to do better in government. Oftentimes I do just feel like a bureaucrat pushing papers, and it's SGC with these tremendous ideas on how we could be doing better. And I know so much of that comes from partnering with all of you in the room. And it's really the sense of co-powering one another. It's government and community leaders and tribal leaders and business at the table together, shaping our climate programs for investments and our climate policies. And it's the commitment the governor and I make to you all every day. With that, I am very excited to listen to the rest of the discussion. We have an exciting year ahead and looking forward to partnering with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you for all of your incredible leadership at the state. We're so glad that you are where you are and helping with these really, really important questions. So I am really excited to introduce Mayor Virgosa today. He will be giving us a talk, but then also bravely is taking questions from the audience. So please be thinking about what you would like to ask. So Antonio Virgosa is a respected voice in American politics and a prominent policymaker with a keen understanding of American mainstream and emerging communities. He's known for his exceptional skill at building broad bipartisan coalitions, and he draws support from the broad center of progressive, Democrat, and Republican workers. So Mr. Mayor Virgosa is currently a partner and co-chair at Actium, where he focuses on strategic and crisis communications, advising C-suite executives in large public and private sector organizations. In August 2022, Mr. Virgosa was appointed to be the infrastructure advisor to the state of California, working on local, state, and federal leaders to identify priority projects and maximize access to federal funding across all regions of the state. And in 2023, Mr. Virgosa finished his 2 terms as the 41st mayor of the city of Los Angeles. And after 8 years of major strides in transportation, crime reduction, infrastructure, energy and resource sustainability, right-sizing government, business development, and education reform. Now, in his free time, which I cannot imagine there is much of, he also serves on numerous nonprofit board of directors, UC Merced, Altamed, Peace Over Violence. And as we learned this morning, he's quite a good artist as well. He took part in our community art project and went right in with the paintbrush and added a wonderful contribution to part of our joint art project. Mr. Mayor, welcome.
I always like to say that I wrote that introduction myself. Thank you for that generous introduction. It's great to be here with you. I can tell you that, yes, you can take it. See, you can hear me the same way, right? Want to acknowledge all of you who organized this conference, OPR as well, and got some new information about how the OPR has gone from 100 to 200 or a little less than that, and people. And I think it's a testament to the governor that he realizes that there's a real opportunity for us to rethink how we grow, to rethink. When I did the painting a few minutes ago, I talked about growing and thriving together. You know, people love to talk about we're the fourth largest economy in the world, and we are. But we also have the highest effective poverty rate in the United States of America, maybe the Western world. And, you know, I believe that one of the biggest issues facing us is that we have to address the fact that we're leaving too many communities behind. You mentioned, Lauren, and thank you for your comments. You know, your father grew up in Boyle Heights, so did I. And I can tell you there are 5 freeways in Boyle Heights. And there are 5 freeways in Boyle Heights, not because it's a strategic location in Los Angeles, but because they knew they could build those 5 freeways without a lot of community opposition. The Santa Monica Boulevard was supposed to be a freeway, but of course it was going to go to Beverly Hills, and they weren't going to allow that. And so this thinking along the lines of equity, I think, is very, very important. Now, I've had the opportunity to, along with them, I want to acknowledge California, the folks from California Forward who are here. Is it just you, Ish, today? And Egon, thank you for the work that you've done. They have been, you know, someone mentioned staff, or team. The team was the folks at California Forward who we brought in because we needed to augment our efforts. And I also want to acknowledge, thank you, Ish, I was going to do that. I also want to acknowledge Boston Consulting, who put together, obviously, with California Forward and under my direction, put together, I think, a very important set of recommendations. Because, Noreen, you said something that I think is important, and I've said it before. You know, I hear people talk about climate change being the biggest challenge, the biggest threat to humankind, and it is. But one of the things I say to those people, if it's the biggest threat to humankind, why aren't we treating it like an emergency? Why don't we have this sense of urgency with respect to how we're addressing it? Why have we focused so much on the perfect and, you know, not doing enough with respect to the good? And, you know, if the governor appointed me for a reason, I think it has to do with the fact that, you know, we were practical in those 8 years, built more infrastructure than anybody in those 8 years. And so what I have focused on in meeting with more than 1,000 people, speaking to thousands, when you look at the conferences I've been invited to, from the Mexican border to the Oregon border, some 33 cities, is that we have to have a sense of urgency with respect to this. I was mayor during ARA. I remember those hearings. I remember the bridge that went to nowhere. I remember the criticism, particularly on one side of the aisle that was never for any of that, that, you know, really just went after cities like LA, and, well, actually they didn't focus on us. They didn't go after us, but they went after cities all across the country. And so one of the things we've talked about in the course of all of this is the issue of how do we accelerate these projects? You know, we don't like to talk about the fact that it takes longer to build things in this state than virtually any state in the country, and it costs more. And let me tell you something, with the change in leadership in the House, I think it's pretty clear what we're going to see. It's a lot of hearings. Why haven't you spent the money? Why does it cost so much? You know, all of those things. So we have focused on a number of things that are going to address the issue that this is an emergency. So we got to build faster, smarter, better, more inclusively. So we've talked about, you know, I think all of you know, when we built SoFi Stadium and we built the basketball arena here in Sacramento, we limited the time that you could sue to 200, and I think it was 267, maybe it was 257 days. You still have rigorous review. You still have, you know, an effort to make sure that what you're doing is, you know, respecting the surrounding communities, but we're limiting, you can't do it for 5 years. Two, we've said that we got to streamline permitting. Do you all remember Karma Heaven? I know you don't remember it because it didn't happen. I'm sorry, it did happen. What you remember, it was Carmageddon. It didn't happen. And it didn't happen precisely because what we did was we went to the legislature and said, it's going to take too long to expand the 405. It's just going to take us too long. So we got an alternative delivery method, design build. We said as well that permitting, in the city of Los Angeles and in the county of Los Angeles and at the MTA and at Caltrans take too long. So we put them all in one group to look at how we streamline that permitting. And early on, I found out that one of my own agencies, Department of Water and Power, was taking too long and was delaying the project. And so somebody almost lost his job as a result. Just kidding, but made it really clear that we were going to hold them accountable to moving this. So the Carmageddon never happened. It was Karma Heaven. When you remember that, those of you who live in LA, it didn't happen. All of the things that they said, but we did things differently. We weren't looking for the perfect. We wanted to get it done right, be inclusive with respect to community, but, do it in a way that made sense. So in the course of all of this, we've looked at the fact that in addition, that we need legislation to do design build, progressive design build, job order contracting, something novel in California and in the rest of the country, and that's public-private partnerships. You go around the world, those of you who know a little bit about infrastructure, everywhere in the world, people do public-private partnership, except for the United States of America, which does very little. Red states do more than we do, but none of us do it enough. What can that do? You accelerate a project, you streamline permitting, and you bring new pots of money. So we've looked at that in the course of these meetings. In addition to that, we focused on equity, and I'm glad you mentioned it, Lauren, and I know all of you are focused on it. 30 minutes? Okay, I don't need that much time. And I think what we said was we're gonna have question and answers because I think people wanna. So equity. Yesterday we had a meeting with some of the folks here, and one of the things I've argued for, you're gonna need a war room. There's $110 billion, $47 billion from the state, $50 to $60 billion from the feds, depending on how smart we are with respect to competitive grants. And we said we gotta have transparency, we gotta have dashboards, both external dashboards for the public and internal ones, so that all of those agency heads are breaking down silos, looking at how we can accelerate these, but also looking at the issue of equity. Because the IIJA talks about equity being a principle here. We don't want to go back to the days where you put all of the infrastructure in one community and then don't mitigate. One of the things I've argued is I want to mitigate in Boyle Heights in South LA, or Fresno and Stockton, similar areas and across the state, in the same way you do in Beverly Hills and Marin County. And that means people should be included, but that means that there should be community benefits as well when you do this. And community benefits cost add to the cost, but they're important. And if you're accelerating, they don't add to the cost in the way that they would add if you weren't accelerating. So this issue of equity is absolutely critical. And one of the things I've said as I've gone to these meetings, if we don't have metrics by it, if we haven't defined what the elements of equity are, then we're going to miss the forest for the trees. We really are. And so equity, really critical. workforce development and, apprenticeships. One of the things that we, figured out pretty quickly, we don't have the people to do $110 billion internally and externally. Do we have the staff here in the state to approve $110 billion of projects? When I said that to the feds, they looked at me and said, do we have the staff to do $1.2 trillion worth of projects? But also externally, we don't have the construction workers right now, today, to do $110 billion of projects. By the way, so that you understand, 70% of the projects are transportation. On the old 80-20 split, which I didn't understand, because if climate change is the big issue, why are we spending so much money on highways and not enough money on transit? But, I'm not in the Congress. But, it's certainly an issue. Oh, in addition to speaking to the feds, one of the things I did early on, I did it before Caltrans, I did it virtually before anybody in California, was I said, we have the most rigorous environmental review in California, and then we do NEPA, CEQA, then we do NEPA afterwards. Why aren't we doing them together? Well, why take another 2 years to do that? And so I was able to get for America Fast Forward, which I got President Obama and Nancy Pelosi and Senator Reid to get behind. We were able to get that approval. We have that currently on a few projects, on a number of projects at Caltrans, or get the name of the agency now, and a little bit in the water area. We need to do a lot more of that. And that's another thing that can provide for acceleration. But back on workforce training and apprenticeship programs, I believe that we should have a statewide project labor agreement. I think it makes sense. I did 126 of them, more than any city in the country, but I did something differently. I didn't just cut that deal. I said, you can't strike during the course of this. Pay you great wages, but there won't be, we're not gonna, we're gonna work things through. I said, there aren't African Americans on construction sites, and we did 20. I said, I want to have metrics by the number of African Americans. Latinos can't just be laborers, everybody. They got to be operating engineers, they got to be electricians, they got to be all of that. Women, a woman can bang a hammer like a guy. And I said, I want to see women honored, in our apprenticeship programs. And finally, I said, the formerly incarcerated, rather than being homeless, let's put them in a job. Because I could tell you what a job can do for a man or a woman. It changes their lives. And so in terms of equity, that's an important part. We want our workforce, and the feds did what I did in LA, local hire. I don't think, the governor or any of us want to see people coming from, Arizona and Nevada working here. We want to see the taxpayers of this state working on those projects. And particularly when they're working in projects, with high unemployment and high poverty, we want the people that live in those communities to work on those projects. I figured that local hire out early on when I went to one of the first projects, and I said, hi, where do you live? Arizona, Temecula. So nice places, but well, for us, Temecula is great because that's the state of California. But for me at the time, it was LA, and I said, well, Temecula, where's South LA? Where's Boyle Heights? Where's, Van Nuys and some of the other areas of this town? So we're looking at all of that equity. One of the great things about the IIJA with respect to equity and inclusion is we want to diversify the contractors in this state. Now we have limitations in the state level, as we all know, with affirmative action, but this gives us an opportunity to, create wealth and in communities that have been left behind. So those are some of the opportunities here. I don't want to go on and on. I think I'm probably about 15 minutes. And I told people I'm not doing a 30-minute talk because nobody wants to hear me. I think they prefer having a question and answer. So with that, be more than happy to kind of take some questions if you have them. If you don't, be more than happy to leave you and have somebody else come and speak. So any question?
Good morning, Mayor. Good morning, Mayor Villaraigosa. It's good to see you.
Great to see you.
I'm Catherine Perez from Los Angeles, and I just
Yeah.
want to say thank you for being here, and to SGC and the whole team doing this, and to Lauren, thank you so much for setting the tone this morning. The thing that we were talking about yesterday in our breakout sessions was why during COVID did kind of bureaucratic governmental structures kind of move. You know, we got al fresco streets. We did things really quickly to address the economic and kind of social needs we had. We've demonstrated that we can accelerate and kind of ensure that people get the things that they paid for, either through taxes or measures or whatever. And also that we're taking care of the equity issues around access and stuff. So we've done it, and we did it just recently, and COVID showed that we can, in the state and cities and all kinds of jurisdictions. And you were talking about, and thank you for meeting with a number of us in Los Angeles. I appreciate that. What I'd like to know is how can we take that demonstration that we just went through and make that happen on massive projects, not, you know, by stepping aside from public process, but ensuring that we actually can deliver on these massive infrastructure projects that we need so badly.
Well, I've argued, and up to now, you know, they've had a few staff focused on this, the agency heads, but I've argued you got to have war room for this. We've never spent $110 billion like this in 5 years on projects. If you don't have a war room with people dedicated full-time focusing on this, it's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. You know, and I think we're already moving ahead on the issue of metrics. I'm a big believer, you know, before I became mayor, if you would have told me about, I was speaker, as some of you know, you know, if you would have talked about metrics and dashboards, I wouldn't. In fact, when they first talked to me about dashboards, I didn't know what they were talking about, but I did it for 8 years, and we're going to do it here. And they're already doing some of that, but you have to have people focused on this 24/7, or it's not going to happen. And you got to have people responsible. You know, the way the metrics works, you have a timeline, you have people that you could look at in the eyeball and say, you're responsible, obviously an agency, but you're responsible to make this happen. And you have periodic, we used to do quarterly, periodic, but sometimes we would do weekly on some things that were particularly, you know, time sensitive. You got to, on a continual and constant basis, be on top of these projects. Otherwise, they're not going to happen. They're just not going to happen. So that's, for me, that's a real key. If you don't have that kind of war room, for instance, you know, for instance, with permitting, we've already talked about, and I think the governor's folks, I think giving them credit here, governor's folks we're already working on reducing the time, for instance, for broadband from about 33 months. They've taken the permitting down to 16. The goal is to take it to 11. Think about that. That's what acceleration of projects can do. Cut the time to build, you know, make sure that you're save some money, and then, you know, but it's not, you know, and then increase the pot of projects that you can work on. And one of the things we've estimated, I think Boston Consulting estimated, we have $110 billion worth of projects, never spent anything close to that in a 5-year period, but minimum 330 billion worth of projects. So if it's not transparent, if we don't have people focused on it, that $110 billion is going to be, more like, in real dollars, like 80, 90, maybe even less. I don't know. I'm not an expert, but I can tell you this. I know what happens when you take too long, when, costs go up. So, I think a war room, people focused, metrics, dashboards, both internal and external. People aren't going to be happy when they don't get a project. But when they can look at how it was kind of, transparently, how they decided on that project, I think they feel better about it than when they can't and just say, well, what was that decision based on? And that's particularly true for equity. I know that's something that you focused on a lot. I never talked about equity inclusion, but my entire life has been focused on it. I didn't know that term, wasn't something that we talked about, but we always focused on it. I spent more time thank you, but I spent more time in Watts when they did a thing. When they did a thing of where I was at my 8 years, I spent more time in Watts than any part of the city. Why? Because it was the place that needed the city, the mayor, and I think that's what we're going to have to do here. Focus on equity and have metrics with it. I'll cut my answers down a little shorter. I always get going.
Mr. Mayor, good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Larry
You
Cosmont.
don't age, by the way. You look great.
Thanks. We're about the same.
You
age,
don't
so-
either, by the way. You don't either.
So Larry Cosmont Companies, we have over 150 public agency clients. The way that I think you could be a tremendous help is, as you know, the state of California has approved and authorized these climate resiliency districts locally, which use tax increment to leverage the private sector investment and combine it with our public sector investment. So we can quadruple the value available for these local communities of need. But there's never really a clear nexus and message to local government that if they use these districts, they'll be in line for a priority allocation of these funds, which really help places like Linwood and all these agencies we work with. So I guess my question to you is, can you look at these climate resiliency districts, which got authorized effective January 1, and make them a priority in the allocation of capital projects so we can work with these local communities and get them enthusiastic about adopting these resiliency districts and going to work? And these resiliency districts can work on water, flood, fire, sea level rise. It's the whole gamut of everything we're trying to sort of resolve.
I think, well, first of all, I'm not the governor and I don't work in the state. I'm just an advisor. It's certainly what I would argue for, but that's a decision that I wouldn't be making necessarily. In fact, what I've said from the beginning, look, I'm going to put forth these recommendations, could either take them, reject them. I don't have this, I'm not married, but they are to them in the sense that I understand that there may be other issues that mitigate against doing some of that or militate against doing some of that. But I do believe, in answer to your question, that those ought to be some of the priorities, not the only ones. There are other things that we have taken consideration, but certainly one of them. I think, LA did the first with UCLA, the first climate adaptation and resiliency plan, I think, in the country, as I recall, at least what we said at the time. I think it was in 2009 or 10 or I don't know, time to the loss, but so I believe that that's what we ought to do. But it's just a recommendation.
We have a question over here in the back.
Hello, my name is Vamsi Kotla from Remo Homes.
I'm sorry, your name is what?
Vamsi Kotla. I'm from LA. You're my mayor. Actually, you're my councilman back in San Fernando Valley in early 2000. So I've been following your journey for a long time.
Well, I wasn't a council member in San Fernando Valley. I was on the east side, but
Sorry.
I was your mayor.
You're my mayor for
And
8
thank you.
years. So I agree that we should announce or declare a climate emergency. I would say we do the same for housing as well throughout the state and throughout the country. I come from a modular construction background. We feel we can build and install homes in record time, like days, not weeks, not months, years, but days. But there's still a lot of red tape, a lot of differences between even adjacent cities in building codes, and a lot of cloudiness in the financing aspect of things. Is it something you thought about or advised, Governor?
Well, I think the governor and his staff, his team, already focused on some of those issues. When I spoke to him about what these recommendations were going to look like, he was, and we know each other fairly well. We used to debate a few times a few years ago, and I know what his position was on a lot of this red tape, and we shared a similar vision for what you need to do. So I think they're focused on that. What I particularly am focused, because I'm a practical person, everybody. I'm a progressive. I've called myself a progressive for 40 years, not last week. But I tell people, when you focus on letting the perfect on the perfect, and don't get anything done because you're focused on the perfect, that's not my job. So what I would argue for the state on some of this, let's move this ahead. It doesn't have to be perfect, but what we've had up to now, we haven't had equity. Let's be clear about that. We take too long, and it costs too much. And we could do it differently and still be very vigorous in our review and our community input. We could do it differently, but you have to have a sense of urgency. You have to have those metrics. You have to have a team dedicated to it. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. I mean, I just tell you, you'll be here 3 years from now and say, or 4 years from now and say, what did we do with this money?
Hi, Mayor. Mine's a brief one. I just want to know, can cities anticipate receiving an allocation for basic projects like sidewalk infrastructure? We know that Sacramento in the past prioritized, glitz and glamour that we've seen in some of the areas of the Coachella Valley. But reality is that most communities just need sidewalks in areas that are lacking sidewalks, removing tripping hazards to remove some of our JPIA claims. And, we're tired of competing with big cities like Sacramento, LA. We just need an allocation that says, here's your $1 billion, go build your sidewalks. Reality is it's really difficult as a small community to be able to write these grants with all the extended public outreach. Some communities have CDOs, more rural California doesn't have that. And so I just ask that when you are, speaking to the governor, that you consider smaller communities such as ours that really just need that allocation that says, here, be transparent, hire or follow all your DBE goals. We will do that. But please don't make us compete again with the communities that have these resiliency plans. That is something that larger affluent cities do. Small communities really just don't have that bandwidth. And so I'll leave it at that. For the smaller communities that are here, I'm sure tribes can also relate to some of this. Competing is exhausting.
Both. Just so you understand, both the governor and that was my recommendation. The first city we went to was Fresno. We brought all the surrounding small cities there. I spent 1 day, maybe 2. I think it's 1.5 in LA, 1.5 in the Bay Area. Most of these were throughout the state. I met with cities of 7,000 people, 12,000 people. The issue you raised is a legitimate issue, an important issue. We heard it at virtually every place where there were smaller cities. We heard it everywhere. We don't have staff to compete. So one of the things I've argued with the governor, advocated for, with the governor's folks is we should spread the money, not like peanut butter, because that will not work. But we should spend it over, 8, 9 regions. And we went up and down the state through those regions. And the issue you raise is a legitimate issue, and we're gonna have to address it because some of these communities are just, they don't have, I mean, they have, 30 people working in the city. They don't have OPR has 300 people, is that what you told me? I mean, they don't have 300 people doing policy and research. They have one person doing 5 different things that, so I think that's a legitimate issue where, money for sidewalks, I put $500 million in South LA quietly. Didn't say anything. I just put it over an 8-year paving alleys, doing sidewalks, I didn't say much about it because everybody else would have been upset that I was taking it from other places, but I knew it was righteous and important. And I think that's what we're going to have to do here too, because some of those, I mean, I went to visit towns where people get cases of water to bathe. Come on, this is not Flint, Michigan. This is not Jackson, Mississippi. This is California. So 100% agree with you. 100%. Again, just recommend. But we heard it so often that they've acknowledged that we're going to have to do something about the fact that a lot of these small towns can't, don't have the resources wherewithal to apply for some of this grant. So working with them, but you have to be aggressive at going to them and saying that. And I always tell people, I've been screamed at, I've been picketed, I don't have a problem with transparency. I don't have a problem with people holding you accountable, and none of us should. And I don't think the governor does or any of the staff. So, you gotta push for that. You definitely got to push for that. I mean, I won't call on people. I guess somebody else will.
Thank you.
Trying to look at you.
Right here.
The reason why I'm moving around, trying to look at people without this.
Dan Cobb, council member in the city of Oakland. Thank you, Mayor Villaraigosa, for being here.
Okay.
And thank you for identifying climate as a true emergency. And thank you for all your work as speaker and mayor. Would you support a state requirement that all regional MPOs and county transportation agencies evaluate and prioritize all proposed transportation projects through the lens of, is it consistent with their regional sustainable community strategy and is consistent with the state's climate goals, including reducing VNT, to the point of even not going forward with transportation projects that are antithetical to achieving our climate goals? Would you support a state requirement like that?
I think as a general, I mean, want to see all the specifics. And again, what I'm not is dogmatic. So as a general proposition, yes, but let me just say this. For 30 years, I fought the extension of the Long Beach 710 freeway because I said, as soon as you build a freeway, you fill it up. And there it made sense. But when you take the position as an example, we'll build no freeways anywhere or not expand a freeway anywhere in the state, then you go to some of the communities that you just mentioned, they don't have a bus system. They don't have, they only have a car and some of those roads do need to be expanded. So as a general proposition, yes, but not applied in a way that doesn't take into account some of these local needs. And I'll tell you, I spent a lot of time over there and there's a big local need. So as a general proposition, yes.
And we have time for one more question. Thank you, everyone who's been able to offer some during this time.
Thank you. I'll be brief. Flora O'Connor, I had the pleasure of working with you during the 8 years as you built what's now the Green Plan for Los Angeles, one of the first in California and LA, deputy mayor. And one of the things you did is very strong community engagement in the process across sector. And so one of the things that I heard a lot of yesterday is that in the Justice 40 outlines, there's there's a provision for oversight that's actually community engaged across sector. And I wonder what you all are thinking about that in your conversations and how there was in some of the earlier drafts of Justice 40 last year in the legislation, et cetera, provisions for that. And what are you all thinking in that along those lines?
I met with Isaac Bryan, Assembly member, yesterday. And I said, look, I'm not the governor, I'm only an advisor, but I 1000% agree. If you don't have accountability and you don't, look, I believe I was a chief executive, but I was also speaker and a council member. I believe in the legislative branch of government. And I believe that they have every right and responsibility representing the public to have oversight and accountability. So I told him, from my vantage point, I would argue, advocate to the governor's office that, yeah, we should have legislative oversight. We all want to continually, just like we want dashboards for all of the folks that are going to do this stuff, we also want dashboards for ourselves. And that's what an oversight is. How are we doing with equity? How are we doing with transparency and all of that? So I'm 1000% for it. Again, I only can advocate and advise, but yeah, I believe in it. I did it, as you said, wasn't perfect, by the way, because I also said, we got to drive this, we got to move it. So look, I want to thank you. I think testament to the governor and his team that he's put the amount of people in the Office of Policy and Research to really think about the future. But I want to leave you with one thing. If that future is a future where we continue to be a state, where we have the 4th largest economy with the highest effective poverty rate, if we continue to be a place where so many people are left behind, where we focus on, well, I used to say when we focus just on the people who drive a Tesla and not drive a Toyota pickup or ride a bus like my mother did, then we're missing the forest for the trees, everybody. This has got, well, thank you. So thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Mayor, Lauren, thank you so much for being here with us today and also for all of your leadership in the climate equity space and for all the work that you both have done all around the state to be able to help really make sure that we're meeting our goals and our targets. Okay, so before we go to break, can everybody go under your seats and get out your placard? Just want to do kind of a quick check to see where we are this morning. All right, so how many people yesterday ran into an old friend they hadn't seen in a while? Yes. All right, how many people met somebody new? Awesome. How many people shared an experience or an idea that they've been sitting with for a while? Good. And then, oh, keep your hands up. How many of you got feedback from sharing that experience? So, okay. How many of you put together a plan or thought about how you're going to continue thinking through next actions or activities with somebody or a group? What are you that you're going to keep working on as you leave this conference? Love it. Love it. All right. How many of you ate more than 2 cookies from the dessert bar yesterday? How many of you had more than 2 beverages last night at the party? All right, very good. Okay, thank you. All right, so we are going to take a break. We'll be coming back into this room again at 10:15 for a panel on mobilizing finance. While you are in the break, please coffee, snacks, but also if you haven't had an opportunity to write a message on one of the leaves on our project, on our art project, please do so. And also if you haven't visited our garden, we have put together a garden walk that talks about transformation stories in California. So these are stories that we hope will inspire and share what is possible and would love for you to visit. And we'll see you back here at 10:15. Thanks, everyone. So come on in, come on in. All right. Okay, if everybody could come in, take a seat, we'll get ready for the next panel. Yep.
All right, everybody, welcome back. We're going to get started here with this panel. We were warming up. We were just admiring one another's socks, which are very visible here. So you can have a little poll about who's got the snazziest socks when we're done. That was a great setup for what we want to get into in this session, which is going to be a combination of thinking about how capital is actually accessed for climate solutions equitably, and how individual companies and projects are approaching that opportunity, and what we can think about collectively in view of the issues we wrestled with yesterday about how to institutionalize the best approaches to these challenges and really reflect that back into the state's organization as we go and get these funds. Now, one thing that struck me so far really is that missing middle. You know, we think a lot about capital, and we're obviously motivated by the huge resources the federal government has put forward. But as we get closer and closer to that money potentially being available to us, it becomes more and more clear, at least to some of us in the day-to-day action of organizing it, that each program is different. There's not any one entity that's going to come and write a great big check for us, and then we'll figure out how best to deploy it on our own. So it really is a question of specific tactics and specific processes of community engagement that would validate a certain project and let that project access these funds, which are, again, once in a lifetime opportunity. And hopefully with us for decades, we can recycle them and redeploy them. But it really has to be a mindful exercise on behalf of policymakers. And so sitting and reflecting on the conversation yesterday, I've struck by a tension that I think we all face in the climate space, which is the urgency of getting things built, which has animated so many of our goals and our progress as a state. These big lofty targets, these world-leading goals and aspirations cannot come at the expense of durable community engagement, not just because that's an ethical principle, but it actually goes directly to how we're going to get these things done. And my work right now at the Infrastructure Bank, just briefly to characterize what we're doing, is really about making that connection obvious and hopefully clear to policymakers and investors. It used to be the case that entities would come forward and say, we have a great idea, we've got some money, we want to build this thing. And then somewhere later on, they would say, well, where's the community on this issue? And what can we do to get the community on our side? It was very kind of operational like that. We just need to get them on board and that all will be well. And that came, 3, 6, 9 months into the process. And then they were surprised that there was some opposition. And then we hear about all the delays and the cost increases that the mayor spoke of this morning, and then the project would fail completely. Now we hear that as a first question, really. Where is the community in regards to this infrastructure idea or this infrastructure opportunity? Who's doing the work of making sure they're involved and on side and seeing their interests and benefiting materially from the outcome? Doesn't mean that we've solved the problem and answered the question, but more and more in the investors that we need to leverage, the extra capital we need to bring to bear from the outside is focused on this issue. So this is our chance, I think, to reshape the conversation that we've been sitting in as advocates and impassioned proponents of this equitable development strategy, but institutionalize that frame. If you've got a project, the community's interests need to be represented first. The communities must be resourced to participate authentically without somebody else's agenda. Not just because it feels good, although it certainly does, it's the right ethical approach, but it is essential to the development of the project and its effective execution over time. So I think that's a healthy turn. And now we've got this opportunity to use these federal resources to really put that into institutional practice for the long run. And this panel is going to help us figure it out in the next 50 minutes. We're going to come away with all the answers, no doubt. So that's me, Dan Adler. That's the role of iBank. We think about things as a public investor, leveraging public dollars, a little bit of public money where we have it, against a lot more private activity, aligned investments, all the ESG strategies you can think of. But at the end of the day, it's the folks on the ground that are building the projects and mobilizing other resources and doing the community engagement that is essential to the outcome. So I'm going to let my panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll get into some Q&A. We've got a nice script here, thanks to the SGC folks, but we're going to keep it loose and conversational, and I'll pick up on some of the themes we hear and have a little bit more of a dialogue. So why don't we go down the line with some brief intros?
Green light. My name is Jana Gagnon. I'm the Sustainability and Government Affairs Director for the Blue Lake Rancheria. It's a federally recognized tribe up near the Eureka Arcata area behind the Redwood Curtain. And I want to shout out to the Karuk tribe and the Hoopa Valley tribe and others, Jacqueline, Raven, Shay in the audience. It's great to be here and be able to work on these things together. And can I just say, can we just give a round of applause for the IT team? It is hard to do this work, and we really thank you for your help. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Good morning, Mike Walsh, Deputy Director, Riverside County Housing and Workforce Solutions. I am pitch hitting today for Heather Vicona from Lift to Rise. She had a medical emergency, so she sends her regards. I hope I can do her justice here today. The Riverside County and the nonprofit Lift to Rise have embarked on a 5+ year public-private partnership on how we address rent burden in the Coachella Valley through the rapid expansion of the development of affordable housing.
Aloha kakahi kakako. I'm Lauren Gratton. I identify first as a mixed race woman of color, and that's important. I'll talk about it. But I also am co-founder and chief community officer of Mission Driven Finance, a private impact investment firm based in San Diego on Kumeyaay land. And I have had more times introducing what is impact investing in the last couple of days than I'm used to, but I'll give you all a definition of that, which is comes from my colleague, Ted Levinson. And he says, mainstream investing is moving money based on the future you predict. And impact investing is moving money based on the future you want. So what we do at Mission Driven Finance is help design, develop, and manage impact capital vehicles that are centering community first, and particularly overlooked and underestimated communities. I don't have oodles of money myself. I help reconnect that capital into community using primarily private capital, but also, as Dan mentioned, leveraging state and federal money as well. Thanks.
Hey, good morning. I'm Adam Browning. I'm with a company called Forum Mobility. And what we're doing is looking to electrify drayage. That's the movement, the heavy duty goods movement in and out of ports. When ships come in with all those containers, they've got to get out of the port, through the communities, and to a distribution center. Currently mostly done with diesel. We're trying to do that with really big electric trucks. We do this by building a network of heavy-duty charging depots and then providing either charging or charging plus a truck, and I'll talk about why that's important, for one low monthly fee that can meet or beat the cost of diesel right now. So it's a really exciting time in terms of the transition away from relying upon diesel for transportation of all of our goods, the lifeblood of many economies, to zero emission solutions.
Hey, good morning. I'm Matt Horton. I'm newly christened senior advisor with the Milken Institute, and also I'm director of state policy and initiatives for Accelerator for America. And under that banner, what we're hoping to do and in the process of doing is engaging a landscape analysis of investment needs across communities in California and how we can plug those needs with technical assistance and capacity building efforts so that we can draw down and make the best use or equitable use of the funding moment that we've all arrived in.
Great, thank you all. Lauren, I'm going to turn back to you. I think what you mentioned about that frame around impact investing and the future that we seek or aspire to, it really resonated. I could tell in the audience as well. Could you say a little more about what that work is like in California at the community level? So there's obviously the investors and finding the right partnerships, but again, this theme is about making sure that the communities are, if not first in the conversation, they're co-equal and ready to participate from the first moment.
Absolutely. So like I said, we help to design, develop, and manage impact capital vehicles, and you start with the design. And I talk about this when we have a few that we designed ourselves, and then many that we do in partnership with communities across the country. I'm based in San Diego, so we have a lot of California. So about half of our work has been in California thus far. But we started in San Diego and said, there are loan programs that exist, but they're not accessible to the full community. There are people who are doing great things. They are hiring from the community. They're building affordable or attainable housing. They're selling into supply chains with our corporate and government partners, but they don't have access to capital to grow their business and continue providing these opportunities. So can we design something that is comparable in cost to maybe the SBA, but more accessible for entrepreneurs? And from doing that work in San Diego, then we had more partners coming to us saying, hey, can you help us design a structure like that too? So one of those is the LA Clean Tech Incubator. Many of you know Lacey. We run the Clean Tech Debt Fund for them, which is providing access to capital for clean tech entrepreneurs that come through Lacey or one of their 3 clean tech incubator partners. And they're largely entrepreneurs of color. They are trying to innovate on climate solutions, and they need access to capital to be able to pay for their first contract, or they get a grant from the California Energy Commission. And then we heard from Lauren earlier that we're changing some things to have advanced pay instead of reimbursement. But for those that are still on a reimbursement process, you have sitting there wondering, how am I going to pay for this until I get paid, you know, in 9 months? I got to do all the work, got to hire the people, have to put it together. So we put together a loan program that first provides first customer financing as a bridge loan. So you pay very small interest payments. And then when you get paid, you pay the loan back without using personal credit scores or personal guarantees, because those are racially biased and I don't believe in them.
That's great and neat. Yep. The Lacey example is that's a great program, great operation, and it really makes it tangible. Are there other themes that you're seeing in your kind of connective tissue work of bringing impact capital to community scale projects? What else seems like it's poised to scale up that the audience should think about maybe testing in their own work?
I mean, I'm joined by such fantastic people in thinking about infrastructure and housing. What does a fleet electrification look like? And we like to think about how there are different kinds of tools and different capital sources. I primarily work with private investors, so individual family offices, philanthropy, and some corporations, but those are each looking for different kinds of things, and we can be stronger together by combining these. So we had talked a little bit about, can we be tapping into infrastructure financing that's coming from the federal government through state and be able to build that, but also provide small business loans for the folks that are going to be building the housing that you're working on. How can you have inclusive subcontractor financing? So smaller mom and pop construction, electrician, carpet installers can actually be part of this transition to lower emission targets.
So thank you. Matt, I wanted to turn to you to help us start thinking a little bit about the federal funding opportunity, which we were going to try and unpack this a little bit more in some of the breakout work. But again, it's not one program. A lot of the kind of headline level capital numbers, like $360 billion for climate and clean energy. Much of that is the tax credit allocation, which isn't something that governments, let alone communities, can kind of directly get their hands on and shape and invest. We can make our projects ready and attractive, But nonetheless, it's a private sector activity and you kind of don't want to be too beholden to that. We need an affirmative strategy of our own. So within the IRA is this greenhouse gas reduction fund, the federal version, which is designed to capitalize state level and local green banks who have a mandate or will have a mandate. That's what iBank is working towards, to help local level projects get the early resources they need and identify the projects communities want to see and have actual skin in the game, real equity and real contributions. Can you describe a little bit more about how that is maturing, kind of what you see as the point of that program and how you think it might ideally, or what we need to do to make it ideally situated for California's work?
Yeah, so the GGRF, you know, I got really excited about the prospects surrounding that. And you know, you look at the way that that's structured, whether it's the $12 billion for technical assistance or the other tranche of $7 billion for capacity building or the $8 billion for something else that I forget. I think, you know, the mayor in the last portion really described a scenario around this war room and, you know, how do we make the best use of whether it's the GGRF or the DOE loan program or other tranches of money that the state is now qualifying for. I think what we really need is some sense of a clearinghouse of how the state can be competitive and better utilize and deploy those funds. So and luckily, I think what we have is a roadmap and a framework, but it's a bit fragmented. And this came up yesterday in our conversations. And by fragmented, I mean, you know, it's, you know, we have programs, whether it's Cal EnviroScreen, whether it's you know, the TCC program and ASIC program for affordable housing under Lynn and her fabulous team. And other programs at EPA or Energy Commission. What we need is essentially a clearinghouse. And I think we have a moment here that we can expand, you know, the suite of offerings under the Climate Catalyst Fund to do like an OEM purchasing technical assistance for fleet conversion or, you know, design other types of technical assistance programs that gets community ready. You know, this idea yesterday also came out of our breakout session about, you know, on the accountability side, you know, looking at the ways that the system in place is usually a little bit reactive instead of proactive. And I think that it really resonates here in terms of our ability to get ready while, you know, the funding guidelines at EPA are being decided at the end of this year. I mean, we don't have to wait for the funding guidelines to be, you know, community ready and design ways that we can enhance technical assistance under an array or a menu of options that, you know, enhance community infrastructure design and transit and housing. I mean, there's paths of funding that I think will support all of that. And, you know, whether it's the iBank or SGC, our ability to design the technical assistance and the community outreach needs to be happening, you know, now.
Well, and that last piece is actually want to follow up on that a little bit because you know, we think about our positioning versus these federal funds and what we need to say in order to justify a significant ask so that we can all get the resources to do our work. And at the end of the day, it's about the flow of projects into a fund or into an activity. And so there's a little bit of this notion of, you know, we'll set up a framework, we might have a clearinghouse, somebody else is going to go do the work and, you know, bring us the deals all in a nice little package. And that's just not how it happens. You know, it's not happening anywhere in the marketplace, let alone in this aspect. So do you see an opportunity within the GHGRF, the federal version, to get some resources to the front of the queue for these communities that, you know, have great ideas and they know the technologies, you know, they're not naive about what's possible, but they can't do it for free?
Yeah, I think that's hard to say right now definitively. I'd love to say yes, but you know, and this idea around project readiness versus and project worthiness, I think revolves around our ability to structure project pipelines. Yeah. And you know, to get in a sense of shovel readiness and you know, removing the stigma around P3 and the opportunity there to de-risk and add value and capture value and use those community-based assets to enhance, you know, economic growth. I think these are concepts that we're toying around with here today and how to mobilize them. What I think in order to make, you know, a more equitable community development runway, we're going to have to figure out where we can be strategically like plugging in those either those gaps in the capital stack when they emerge, how we can support small business growth, how we can enhance procurement in terms of project acceleration, that adds to a more equitable outcome.
Yeah, that's great. And you're right, there is a stigma around P3 and not for no reason. Often when they've been tried, it's come at the expense of public interest and public finance, and they're rarely tried in the context of community economic development. It tends to be infrastructure that benefits folks who need it least, right? Speaking of infrastructure that is essential, Adam, let's talk about the electrification of fleets and how you think about the community impacts there. There's a couple of different themes therein, one of which is obviously the local environmental issues and benefits you're bringing to bear, but also the communities as owner operators of these vehicles and what it's like for them to be faced with this transition. And it's not a simple thing for them to change their business models and embrace these significant costs and operating differences.
That's a good point. So I will get a little bit in the weeds of the trucking business. I hope you all indulge me, but I do think it speaks to the fact of when we're thinking about major transitions that are environmentally and climate friendly, we need to ensure that everybody has access to the ability to participate in the benefits of that transition, and that there are soft landings for small businesses, that we're thinking about all the people who participate in this economy and how do they really how do they take advantage of this transition to keep their businesses going. So I'm going to talk about drayage. And so drayage, it's a thing. This is like a registry of types of trucks that go into ports. They got a chassis, and that great big container that are on all the ships, those are lifted off on cranes, dropped onto the trucks, and you have to be on a registry if you're going to be a drayage driver. And then that goes through communities and it goes out generally to distribution centers where that's further broken down for further shipping. So CARB, the California Air Resources Board, has identified drayage for accelerated transition, and as part of the advanced clean fleets will require that 100% of the drayage fleet be zero emission by 2035. And that's about 33,000 Class 8 trucks. Those are the big semi-tractor trailers that you see out there. It's an enormous transition. Just to electrify that, it's going to take about 2.5 gigawatts of new charging infrastructure. That's equivalent to a Diablo Canyon in terms of like the amount of charging that we're going to need to build in about 12 years. Now, 80% of drayage drivers right now are independent owner operators. So it's not just Dan's trucking, it's Dan's truck. And these are really large batteries, and they're not going to just charge with an extension cord out your kitchen window. Moreover, these trucks, you're going to need to install, again, like long-term, pretty expensive charging equipment. And these trucks also are about 10x more expensive than the old dirty diesels that they're driving right now. So, you maybe saw some of the news around new Tesla trucks out there and going out to different fleets. Well, it was PepsiCo that bought the first amount of like Tesla trucks, and that's awesome. They have the resources to do it. But for an independent owner operator that's just trying to get by on a $35,000 truck that he had friends and family come together to help purchase, and it's putting food on his table, and he's proud of his ability to like serve, deliver for his family. It's even with incentives, it's a far cry to get up to spending, $350,000 to $400,000 for a truck that you don't even know where you're going to charge right now. So initially, we just wanted to build charging infrastructure because that was where our skill set was. And through the CEC, there's a lot of community engagement in terms of like where you can site and get funds for charging. But in order to really deliver to the current drivers, we needed to also think about how do you deliver a truck solution. So the long-term total cost of ownership, because maintenance is a lot cheaper, fuel's a lot cheaper. Long-term electric trucks, we can deliver this on a lower cost per mile, but truckers need help accessing that. So there are some loan programs. And if you don't want a loan program, we'll buy the truck for you and give you truck plus charging at a monthly rate lower than your current costs of running a diesel. And this is just, an evolution of a business model that had to meet the current operators' needs where they are right now and allow them to continue with the businesses that they've spent their lives growing as a independent owner operator. So there will be evolutions in this as we go forward. We are in such early stages right now of really building out the transition. But I think this is an example here of policy actually really needs to follow the ability to like build these business models. And I'm here to tell you like that policy is quite imperfect right now in order to like make that actually work. You spoke of like, what is the future you want to see? We're going to have some work in order to really get there. But that in and of itself is like, how do you ensure that the people who are doing this work now could continue to thrive going forward? You need careful attention to the policy as well as the ways of accessing.
It seems like there's also a strong community engagement need or opportunity around the physical location of this new infrastructure that must be built. So how are you thinking about that? It's sort of at the edge of your work as a private business, and then it touches the social good or the collective action problem that is evident in all this. How are we doing on that front?
Yeah, so on two levels, there is strong community activism that is showing up every day, doing the hard work in front of CARB, saying like our communities deserve healthy air. Our communities demand a healthy climate. We need to see this transition. And I would just shout out to the activists who are doing this work and actually making it happen right now. The question of, so right now, CARB and the California Energy Commission will require that you cite and disadvantaged communities in order to access different levels of incentives for building the charging, for example. At the same time, we also see communities that are banning truck parking. It is a little a tension point between like, do communities want to have large truck depots, even if they are clean, continue to be sited where they are right now? I live with this tension every day right now, and we're just trying to do the best that we can in order to look forward to a much cleaner future and work in partnership with communities. But when we look to cite, like we have to lean in, and we have a conversation with community representatives and community groups at the beginning of any type of pre-development conversation.
Thank you, Ed. Michael, tell us a little bit more about the work you've done and how you've seen this challenge of community-oriented investment evolve. You've had success in organizing projects that have all these right levels of community resourcing and buy-in from the beginning. So how have you seen this issue and been able to address it?
So I think probably it's easiest to start at the very beginning with like our partnership with Lift to Rise. And what we saw then is start out at the food bank. And the food bank was seeing that their number of people coming in to get food was increasing every single year. And folks at the food bank asked the question as to like why that is. It's because this is not a sustainable metric of just getting more and more food is not necessarily answering the question, why are they coming here? And after a number of community meetings, data research with USC, they come to pinpoint that this issue of rent burden was affecting more than 2/3 of households in the Coachella Valley. And I would say like, oftentimes when we think about the rents, there's like, oh, it's cheap to live in Riverside County or the Coachella Valley in comparison to LA or on the Bay Area. But the incomes are also substantially less. The Coachella Valley is largely driven by agricultural as well as the tourist business. I'm sure there are people here who are going to be coming to see Bad Bunny at Coachella Fest. But that was like the impact of all of those sort of things is like people are really struggling every day to make rent. And so we started like asking the question with partnership with the Center of Community Investment of looking at how do we address this issue to keep people from coming back in? And so as government, now I'm the government bureaucrat filling in for Heather. Like sometimes we think we're doing a good job with like our one project or our two projects. And we've talked about it today, like the last couple of days of all the great work SGC is doing. And it's great. But what we're noticing is it's not sufficient. Between 2011 and 2018, on average in the Coachella Valley, only 50 new units of affordable housing were being produced. So if you start looking at if there are 33,000 households that are rent burdened in the Coachella Valley, we're like doing 50 units a year isn't enough. And so we did the partnership with the Center for Community Investment, got in there, we met with our coach, and we thought we had a real ambitious goal of us doing 500 units. Cool. And they had to put us on the mat problems, like, yeah, this ain't doing anything. And so we started to have to take a step back and say, how do we convene a table to really lower rent burden by 30% over a 10-year window? So if there's like simple math, if there's 33,000, that's roughly 10,000 units over a 10-year window. And so we started like going through of like aggregating projects that the county may have involved in, but then we started like bumping up to all the people stuff. Like developers, affordable housing developers don't necessarily want to share what projects are working with. Cities may not necessarily, is like, well, why is the county involved in this? Is the city like all the parochial issues that always get in the way of all these sort of things? But over time and aggressively, we developed a pipeline of projects and showing how like different people can onboard in and using like for those improv people in the room, like the yes and. It's like, do we need a single family house, affordable single families? Like, yes. And we need housing for those transition age youth, and we need homeless housing, and we need this. Like, it's not an either or, because either or language is what divides us to keep us from getting to overall level of solution. So that's what we're trying to basically do, is create like an overall inclusive table. And today we have a pipeline of over, and Melissa Dolores, who is here, is a pipeline coordinator, does actually all of the really great work. So all technical questions go to Melissa. But there are over 1,000 units under construction in the Coachella Valley right now. And so, and I have to say, I was probably the biggest skeptic of this entire process, because I like, it's the "O ye of little faith, I'm the doubting Thomas," or like, if I only had the faith of a mustard seed, like you can move mountains. So that, I'm sure if the pastor's still here, he could correct me. But as we move forward on this, like, and it was hard. And I think like recognizing that it's going to be hard, and was said yesterday about Lift to Rise in the county, we were going to break up our forced marriage, because we like we'd speak different languages. Is like they would do something and work outside the system that would piss us off. We would do something that pissed them off. And then we would like, didn't want to like, it's like we could have all stepped aside. But there's a fundamental thing yesterday that was mentioned about starting from a place of value. Like my bosses at the county, like deeply valued, how do we address rent burden? How do we address these folks? And that starts from our supervisor in the district, Supervisor Perez, to our county CEO, my bosses, Heidi Marshall, Carrie Harmon, on how we could actually push this forward, because that was the only, but we stayed in it together for that. And we able to do all of the other intermediate stuff that Heather feels confident enough to allow me to speak on her project. And I think that's in terms of like a lot of projects.
That's a great example, Michael, in its own right. And it actually harkens back a little bit to one of the themes yesterday, that DNA framework we heard about from the professor of data, narrative, action, and struck by how you characterized at the beginning, there was an issue that was right in front of you, but in the analysis of what was causing that issue to be a social concern, kind of the deeper driver was identified. And it's that connectivity, intersectionality that I think we're all always at pains to try and identify and address. Jana, talk to us about your work with Blue Lake Rancheria and the tension I think that must be there in advancing energy access, economic development for an under-resourced community, but at the same time having to run up against this notion of reducing a carbon footprint and keeping within these environmental limits. And that's obviously all across the climate and energy discussion, is simultaneously promoting economic growth, but not burdening communities and individuals who haven't had economic opportunity with the overall climate agenda and need. There's a fairness question there that we have to continuously be mindful of.
Yeah, I think that's well said. The short answer to how we balance affordability and GHG reduction and climate resilient infrastructure really has its roots in forums like this. Because of the Blue Lake Rancheria tribal government's approach to environmental stewardship, paired with the thought leadership of elected tribal leaders, tribal members, and our counterparts at the state of California, and in other sectors, really led to a strategy whereby we were able to choose the most lowest cost, highest value electricity systems for the tribe, which is of course solar plus battery storage. But it was because California had done the hard work to take those technologies to scale that they, at the time we went to implement, were affordable and were squarely the solution for us where the tribe is to make our infrastructure resilient over time. The question for this panel in terms of mobilizing capital into tribal spaces rests on a couple things that I think are really important to understand. Tribal nations are domestic sovereigns. There are 109 federally recognized tribes in California, dozens of non-federally recognized tribal communities. There are 576 federally recognized tribes across within the United States. And so we're talking about essentially working with a set of nations that is, I like to use the UN analogy. It's like working with the UN. Every single tribal nation and community will have distinct values and strategies for climate resilience, unique approaches to climate. And so when I talk today, I'm speaking specifically from Blue Lake Rancheria's experience, and I'm not projecting that onto any other tribal nation or community. I think in our case, in terms of working out a financial matrix to make all these things happen, we've really looked at these projects in a much more de-siloed way than maybe the financial sector is used to thinking about them. So they are meant to have a climate mitigation impact. We have been successful in reducing our overall climate footprint, GHG emissions, by 40% since 2014 across scope 1, 2, and 3. We have been able to work with the state of California as a tribal state government partnership, using particularly leadership from the California Energy Commission, California Utilities Commission, to find that public funding that is paired with generosity from the philanthropic sector, and actually from our private partners. So when we have the public funding and the public ecosystem, and in our case, we partnered with Cal Poly Humboldt and the Schatz Energy Research Center there for integration engineering for these systems. Rambling just a bit, but this is all about how we approach financing and getting these things done. We have to partner for our capacity. We do that first with public and nonprofit partnerships, and then we bring in the private sector for their help. So the microgrids that the Blue Lake Rancheria is known for are really public-private partnerships, but they crucially have that base in a long-term strategic partnership between the state, Cal Poly Humboldt, the Schatz Energy Research Center there, and the tribe. So that's been crucial to be able to obtain, have the capacity to obtain these other sources of financing. And we'll talk a little bit about the details around that in the second question that I know is coming up. But I want to just bring it close with like a real situation. So in 2019, the public safety power shutoff, which are proactive grid shutdowns to prevent wildfire from the electricity grid, we had our first public safety power shutoff, or PSPS, in our region. It affected the northern half of California, really. And so we weren't alone in our suffering, but we have a single point of failure for our electrical infrastructure in our region. It's a coastal natural gas power plant. And so when that's shut down and in these PSPS events, we had our microgrids in place. And so we served the region with emergency services and lodging and food and other services, access to the internet. We had the paper of record publishing from a hotel meeting room. We had evacuees from the wildfire in our events center. We had lots of people accessing ATMs and buying ice and other things that they couldn't get anywhere else in the region because there wasn't power. We ended up saving, we were credited by the Department of Human Services by saving 4 lives in that event. But that's just because the tribe, through its governance structure and its strategy, future-proofing things based on climate science, based on tribal science, have been able to partner with the state and others to arrive at that point with those resources as they were sorely needed. We're doing more of that across the lifeline sectors in these infrastructure spaces. And we'll talk a little bit about the barriers for tribal lands, that they don't own their land. They can't collateralize it. Tribes with gaming facilities, even though they are essentially a tax base, are not, make tribes ineligible for certain kinds of public funding and loans. So there's issues, big structural issues in this financing space and mobilizing capital for tribal nations. But I work with tribal nations all across the country. California, you know, we're not any of us perfect. California and tribal nations within California in certain circumstances are so far ahead of the rest of the country in these spaces that it's a really good ecosystem to work on mobilizing capital here.
That's great. And as you mentioned, there is a second part to this question. I'm keen to get to it, but I'm going to stick to the script a little. And actually, as part of that, I wanted to reflect back on some of the themes that we heard yesterday and in the breakout groups, and point to a couple of different examples of specific things that we're trying to get done as a state that the climate movement, climate justice movement sort of requires, and reflect on how that's actually working. But before I do that, I want to make sure that none of my panelists are sitting on an urgent comment or insight that's been brought up in this discussion. So anybody that wants to speak to what you've heard so far off script, please.
I'll just jump in really quickly. Jana, that example is just amazing. And it speaks back to both what Professor Karthik Ramakrishnan talked about yesterday of having, and that definition of impact investing I gave. But when we have a shared vision for the future that we want, then we can actually mobilize different resources, different assets. You talked about this too, Mike, that the county of Riverside had different things to bring to bear than the community organizing folks in Coachella. And we all have unique strengths, but when we bring them together, that's what's really needed to mobilize finance, is saying, okay, you can do this and you can do this. And I spoke with people from Northern California last night, Siskiyou County folks, nice to see you. But they're saying, like, we also need to separate where we have had money is the power, right? We do a lot in shared ownership at Mission Driven Finance, among other things. But when you separate out who has the money versus who has the voice, those are not the same thing. And we need to make sure that we are lifting that up and that those are weighted equally when we're building these solutions for the future that we collectively inhabit.
Beautiful. Reminder to
on
go
that
off script.
mobilization aspect, I'm reminded of, what the mayor said earlier too about the emergency dynamic. And, Don Howard and I wrote a piece yesterday that was in the Sacramento Bee, and we talked about in that piece the need for, this idea around a new innovative governance platform. And, when we're talking about that emergency element, when the Northridge earthquake destroyed the 10 freeway, I mean, they were able to mobilize the resources there to rebuild that in 3 to 6 months. I mean, because of the emergency around it. I mean, the pressing emergency that we see now with, the lack of equity and opportunity in our communities, the need to store and capture more water, the need to build more connective transit and quicker. This idea around a more innovative governance platform, I think is that emergency moment. And how are we gonna, pound the table, like John Brown, like we need to meet this moment with that kind of urgency with a public upswell of support for, like, to Mike's point and how Lift to Rise was able to do this. Lift to Rise didn't wait for, state support. They said, we're going to build more equity into our communities and we're not going to wait for you to tell us how to do it.
Yep. That's great. Thank you both. The issue I wanted to touch on and reflecting back on yesterday and setting up the last part of this discussion, investment professionals, capital providers, they often come in Bigfoot style and think that they can kind of shape the conversation. And that's offensive and doesn't work in most contexts. But one thing that drives towards is kind of a standardization of certain approaches. And, we've all been part of deals and transactions that have been interesting material and, a good data point, but it really only matters if it happens again and again and again and again. Many times it gets easier and cheaper each time. And so that's the sort of standardization mindset that large scale capital providers operate within. And like it or not, we kind of have to at least participate in that discussion. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the transaction is overly transactional. And the tension is between the transactional nature and what some call the translational nature, or maybe the transformational nature of a deal. Number one, there's nothing wrong with being transactional. If we have power as aligned investors, we can get in and win the transaction, and that's the best outcome. Don't be shy about being transactional when the moment comes. But there are certain things to do ahead of time in setting up our pipeline and our deals and all the things that investors want that would avoid the worst aspects of that transactional experience. And the examples I wanted to point to just briefly, we need to take a lot of the fossil energy out of the home. So we're talking about turning off gas stoves and turning off gas heat. That's great from a climate perspective. It's great from a health perspective, but at the level of the individual renter or homeowner, it's quite invasive. And there's this tendency to make individuals sort of instruments in a broader social agenda. And I think we can say at the beginning of this exercise, that's not the right way to start. So we need a framework that is first and foremost about the interests of those participants in this transaction that gives them what they want, a healthy and effective home and lower costs, et cetera, versus like a community solar and storage project that we heard about. Large scale, community first, those things can be shaped from the beginning by community interests, identifying the land and all the workforce issues, and result in a solid ownership model that benefits the community from the beginning. And not to disparage home electrification, which we have to do, but that second frame of kind of larger scale, community first, we shape the agenda, and then we shop for capital. We find the investors that are aligned with our interests, and then we let them into the deal. We're not going on bended knee to get the capital from them. So don't be afraid of the transaction, but make sure it's on the terms that we set and aligned with all of our ethics and as well as our climate goals. And Michael, I want to kick to you for your reflections on that tension between transactionality and community first. How are you seeing the best examples of that practice showing up in your work?
So I guess the starting point, I failed to mention this, is like Lift to Rise is a collective action network. So they set up a wide variety of table, and it's a little bit like the way I think about my grandmother's house. Anyone who was always welcome, we would just get another board and put it into the table. And so as we're looking at as we're coming forward, so every month the the collective action network meets to discuss a wide variety of things, policy updates, talking about what highlighting cities' work of their housing elements being approved, pro-housing designations. We have Councilmember Oscar Ortiz in the back of the room. At the last meeting, we highlighted a project that was going to be coming forward the Planning Commission to bring up support for that project and ask questions to the developer of how they were going to be integrated in the community. And it was approved. The Lift to Rise turned out over 300 comment cards and 25 people to show up to the meeting that it was ultimately approved 5-0 by the Indio Planning Commission. So big kudos to Indio and the over 500 units that they have going on in their jurisdiction. But this idea of opening a table and having it broad. And like the beautiful thing about housing is you can touch a number of different things. Housing needs water connectivity. And if you put the public financing to build the water extension as part of the tax credits, you can generate tax credit basis off that. So you can allow your public dollars to go farther. Or like this, you place this community solar on that, the electrification of that to make it net zero. These are all things that can be additive as part of using the housing as a base. And like, that's why the table, the collective action made up of cities, made up of other local governments, other entities, other nonprofits, developers, community members, agencies. If people want to jump in to a monthly meeting, it's like the first Wednesday of every month. It can be by Zoom and see how it works. But it's a way of just getting people to come in. This idea of transactional versus translational. I didn't understand the question when it was first said. Like, this, like, what do you mean translational? It's like, so how do you make this easy for people to understand? It's like the basis way. And I think for like community groups, people like, they know the rent's too high. It's a visceral sort of thing. So we have to basically be putting this in like terminology of like, how are this is actually affecting families? Or like I was like, so this is a cool program, but how is this actually showing up for them as individuals? And that's like the work that the listening sessions coming in, and we've allowed different people to come in at different points. People can come in and leave. People get angry, come in and leave. We listen and respond. But now we're seeing like more and more movement going forward, that the community is being more and more confident to coming in and raising up their concerns. So just last week, we heard of a hotel apartment complex in Indio that was looking to raise their rent by 50 to 75%. By having this table of connection, having legal aid attorneys in the room, yet last night they met with the met with the residents to try and see what we can do to keep the people housed. But then we also have the policy advocates in the room that how can we make this a change, a statewide policy, so this doesn't happen to anyone else. By having a real narrow table and saying, oh, these are the 5 people that we're going to have, and these are the only groups that are going to be part of it, you're not able to get that diversity of thought and allow it to be iterative and meet the moments of COVID as it comes about, or wildfires or other sort of crises that may be popping up in the community.
Lauren, kind of picking up on that, we have an opportunity now with these new federal funds, some of which, as we'll hear from Matt in a few minutes, specifically in the legislation, it identifies flows of dollars from the federal government down to local communities and actors to participate in the investment of these funds. But even without that, California is preserving 90% of its historic climate budget. We have resources, we can move dollars around, but it's really a question of who's not in the conversation that needs to be in the conversation. We know who we have and they're doing great work, but who's missing at these community scale investment development conversations that we need to bring in?
That's such an interesting way to think about the question. And following off Mike, I want to like continuing on this transactional and translational. I think part of the issue is thinking of how is the idea even organized, right? Is this a top down, this is coming from federal, coming from state, and then we're involving community in our vision? Or is it a both ways conversation, right? We talk a lot about capacity building, technical assistance. How can we de-jargon the lots of jargon that's out there to make it accessible? But that goes the other way too. How can we train our government, like staff and leaders, to also understand and value what community voices are saying so that they are motivated to change? Let's push for advanced pay instead of reimbursement. Let's have these ways so that there's not a big hurdle to jump over and then have the benefits of an electrified drayage fleet. You can have it's hearts and minds work. So I think of what we need to have in the room is the support for the convening capacity, the work of this kind of room today, the work of being able to break across perceived boundaries. And it's a learning all directions. So I want to make sure that we name those power dynamics and don't try and say, this is what's coming from the federal and going into the community, but also how is community coming back up to be reflected in different layers of our policies and processes. So
That is, it's well said, and it is definitely the case that the language of mainstream finance, at least, is designed to be a barrier to collaboration. Most people, when they use jargon, will try and make it easier for people to digest and kind of bridge that divide. I don't see that in mainstream finance. It's a moat, and it's part of what keeps everybody engaging constructively in the allocation of money over time. So definitely something we need to keep working at. Jonna, tell us a little bit more about the experience with Blue Lake and the formation of projects. There's what the community needs, what the government is seeking, and what the investor community wants, and oftentimes they are not the same. So how do you think about bridging that divide?
I think it's through education. And I just want to follow up on, oh, sorry. To be smarter than the microphone. I think it's about education. I've put a lot of thought into this because we've been having conversations I sit on the Department of Energy's National Working Group for Energy and Infrastructure and Development in Indian Country. And so we've had several meetings with social investors, impact investors. We have the loan guarantee programs and those kinds of things. And I have to say, I don't want to get started on a rant here. But here's some of the barriers that we've run up against in the hopes that it's helpful. And then also I want to talk about some specific solutions that we're seeing that actually started in with tribal nations and with California. So many tribes, not all for sure, but many tribes are working at the community scale with respect to infrastructure. There are some tribal nations that are doing utility scale, purely economic enterprise energy work, but the vast majority of the need and the vast majority of the projects that we foresee underneath this federal and state funding opportunity is our community scale. Those projects for the vast majority of tribes that are smaller are going to be somewhere between $5 and $30 million. Don't quote me on that, but that's where they are. That's underneath the kind of the minimum project cost that makes some more governmental financial structures like bonds it's not a fit. It's too small, but it's too big for potentially using tribal government revenues to self-fund it, even with public grants and incentives. So we need to look at that. We need the financial community to understand that we are talking about infrastructure here. So a patient payback is needed. And I think the last thing that I'll use a specific example about is that we need to really focus on resources for educating the financial community about what it means, what it takes to make investments in tribal communities. The Department of Energy has a tribal energy loan guarantee program. It has, don't quote me on these numbers, but a couple $2 billion in authority. And it's been on the books now for the better part of 10 years. And take a guess on how, 90% loan guarantee. So a lender would assume 10% of the risk for loans under this program. $2 billion plus in lending in authority. Take a guess on how many loans have been promulgated under this program for tribal nations. 0. So we get excited about these programs and we get excited about doing, oh, well, maybe we could do a portfolio of projects that would get us to the $50 to $100 million that is the minimum point of match with these programs. But there are structural deficiencies. Some of that is that the smaller banks, the green banks, the CDFIs, maybe don't have the capacity to loan up at those scales, even with a loan guarantee. The other is just the education around the fact that these are good investments. They're needed, they're sorely needed They're typically, they have a lot of eyes on them. So it's a good ESG and CSR play too. But I'll just leave you with a sense of what we're dealing with, that a program manager in the past for this loan guarantee program said, and I quote, "We need tribal nations to be willing to crawl across broken glass to get to this funding." So that's our world. So we had a very spirited conversation after that comment. And then there's other structural things that I mentioned before, like gaming making gaming facilities, gaming ecosystems being ineligible for certain public funds. That's like saying to California, you're not eligible for public funding because you have a lottery. And COVID didn't help with that. For gaming tribes that had to shut down, for the Blue Lake Rancheria, it was 4 months for public safety reasons. That's like California going without a quarter of its tax base, a quarterly amount of its tax base voluntarily. It's difficult. So I'll just say that the solutions for that, two things, check my notes, are the California Energy Commission's Energy Conservation Assistance Act. These are 0 and 1% loans with a very simple application process. That tribe, we were successful in working with the state, and tribes are newly eligible for that just last month. So that is going to help us. Things like, sorry, I had one more. Things like tribal eligibility and prioritization within California's use of its cap and trade dollars. These are going to help build infrastructure. And this infrastructure, as I said, with the PSPS example, it helps all of California and all tribal nations when it's done well, and it's done well when we work in partnership. So thank you.
Thank you for that, and thank you for closing with some optimistic observations so we can get the broken glass imagery out of our minds here. It does resonate with this notion of a combination clearinghouse and war room, assess the information, make it available for everybody, but also drive certain coordination outcomes with some kind of new intervention. So Matt, is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, the EPA's version, this $27 billion fund, it's a lot of money, it's not a lot of money. How we make it last, what do we think about building that's durable and kind of with us for the long run? Because if we just sort of sprinkle it around, it becomes a one-shot deal.
In terms of durability, I think we should again look towards alignment. Like, how do we align the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund with some of our existing priorities? And how do we highlight those priorities, especially where they are in communities? So, like, where is the alignment with the GGRF with existing programs like transformative climate communities or with ASIC? How can we like highlight those crossovers and then and prioritize that alignment with project development acceleration that Lauren mentioned, that the mayor mentioned. I mean, these are a matter of governance and coordination. I think there's also this idea around project use cases that we can help highlight and create structural pro formas around, that communities can say, hey, maybe I didn't know I could have a virtual power plant in or that we would qualify for things like that. But thanks to this, this helps us not only with the technical assistance, but we can figure out how to scale up and make lasting impact here in terms of providing more, not just infrastructure investment, but more opportunities long term. So I think the coordination element here is key. And again, I think that comes through some type of more clearinghouse dynamic that better highlights those crossovers and structures a deployment process.
Yeah, let's let's talk a little bit more about that clearinghouse concept, because I think it's got a couple of different versions depending on who you're talking to. There's just like the web resource version, which, California has, and it gets better all the time. If you are motivated as an individual or project proponent, you can kind of run the shoot, maybe get some resources, but that's not the same as being deliberate about it and having like a development finance mindset. And development banks are not commercial banks. They don't take deposits and let people do checking. They're not investment banks. They're not trying to drive a profit. They're focused on a certain outcome, socially, environmentally, ethically. And so there has to be some sort of agency there in the kind of, physical sense to not just identify the resource, but bring it to bear, and to me, that is what seems to be possible with this green bank conversation, is a permanent institution with permanent capital. It's not just grant making, but you make the loan, you get it back, you do it again. And that creates a sort of a center of gravity, I would think. Don't you think that we don't know exactly how to do it, but we know we need a place where the work gets done over time. And so that seems to me to be part of this opportunity.
Yeah, I think so too. And and I think it's also an opportunity to take a look, again, at some of the alignment with the financial instruments that we've created in the past 5 years or so, specifically the Climate Catalyst Fund. It may, with the GGRF and others, we might have an opportunity here to rethink how we're doing project pre-development and how we can support some of that with some philanthropic engagement. We can further, leverage our dollars. The Climate Catalyst Fund even notes that we're not going to be able to do this with government funding alone. It's going to take private sector engagement, which leads us down that P3 project development runway in certain circumstances. So identifying those circumstances, what makes sense in terms of that pro forma and how we can structure that pro forma over a wide class of qualifying projects and priorities, I think would make better use of funds and further catalyze investment with vehicles like the GGRF. But again, it's going to be on us to structure that innovative governance platform that can be nimble and quicker on its feet than I am anymore, but in partnership with our local partners, and so that it's reciprocal.
So Adam, back to you on the nature of the challenge that your company is facing. And Forum is a beautiful thesis. It's simultaneously very specific in the market and the need that it's addressing, but also enormous in the challenge ahead. And you've identified a discrete thing that needs doing, but there's so much money that's required. So how are you thinking about as a company, as a partner in this potential P3 mindset, getting the resources together for the long road ahead?
That's a great question. And I do think I love to think micro and then expand back to macro. And I really appreciate focus, figuring out one thing to do and trying to do that right. And once you have a good experience, that builds momentum, that builds scale, that builds good examples, that builds goodwill, that you can then go a lot larger. And so I do feel like this is the tip of the spear on how we're going to transform all of heavy duty eventually. First, drayage, California, then the world. But I would also say that this entire transition needs to earn its social license every step of the way. And any part of that step that doesn't actually make people's lives better, you don't go beyond. And so we're really focused on making sure everything that we do is that A, clean air for communities. B, it's got to work for truckers. And we are hoping to be able to deliver a lower cost per mile with a much better experience for drivers and for truckers. And so that ends up being how do you orient policy dollars to begin to be catalytic, to grow scale, to bring down costs so that government policy dollars aren't necessary going forward. And I think California still has a lot of work to do in this. They're putting a lot of money in it. But for example, the California Air Resources Board runs a program called the Low Carbon Fuel Standard. It's nearly $4 billion a year. If you buy fossil fuel, transportation fuels, you pay into it, and that comes back into lower carbon. Most of that money, 80%, goes to biofuels, which are increasingly crop-based biofuels. Meanwhile, CARB is mandating a transition not to biofuels, to zero emission. So there's an opportunity to take money that they're currently spending and redirect it towards the outcomes and towards the businesses that they really want to see grow. And so that was actually a question that I wanted to ask the mayor earlier. It's not so much like you're talking infrastructure. It's not just what do you want to build, but it's also what do you want to stop doing? And I do think that there's a lot of things collectively across the climate space that we've thought about bridges, and it's now actually time to stop doing the bridges and do the destinations. And I think that's the conversation that collectively we hope to have. So to answer your question in the 2 minutes that we have, and I'll only use 30 seconds of it, is that there's still a lot of policy dollars that can be catalytic that need to really flow to make sure that the small businesses can make this transition, can make this segue, and grow and thrive as we build scale, as we bring down costs. And we've seen this in the, 20 years ago, I got my start in solar. It was the most expensive way of generating electricity. No one took it seriously. It was a rounding error in the overall. Now, it's the cheapest way. It's the fastest growing source of electricity. And it's really the foundation on which our climate hopes rest upon. And that was done proactively and deliberately. Like, there was a thesis of like, through scale, we can bring down costs. I see similar opportunities across the whole climate space, but really is about how do you ensure that you create ecosystems of dynamics where people benefit every step of the way.
You're here. Very well said. And we are closing out here. I want to close out with a lightning round, starting with you, Jana. I'm going to read it so I get it right. For thriving, healthy, and resilient communities, what is one major opportunity you see for the capital community? Capital community broadly defined. People with resources. What's the one thing that we should focus on in your mind?
Prioritizing the climate emergency as part of the portfolio and goals of the financial sector is really important. I don't think it's moving nearly fast enough. And I think philanthropy and others have really stepped into the space of creating these war rooms as we're talking about them, but this pre-implementation capacity to go after the finance and develop those relationships is crucial. It can't be overstated. We said it here time and time again, and we'll say it until we fix it. Thanks.
Oh, well, same question. I would say obviously housing would probably have one, but I would say to that point though, I think the opportunity that we have as everyone is to get out of our own way and get out of our own silos. So if projects need can put water infrastructure and also do housing, why can't we do that together? And why do they need to do a separate, only water districts can apply for this source or only this people can do? I think the big opportunity we have is if we aggregate around a collective result, we can start seeing ourselves in the work more clearly and seeing how we can jump in. And so creating that levels of space and recognizing the diversity of communities throughout that we need both. We need resources in coastal communities, but also don't forget us in the inland part of the state.
I like that. As a vegetarian, I like to say I want to feed two birds with one stone. And I like these strategies of saying like it's not climate or community. Where can we really be looking at opportunities where it's together? And the whole impetus for this conference is talking about the unbelievable amount of money that is coming to do this transformational work. And I say that the opportunity is to take advantage of that and to design the structures that do unlock capital, not the way that the tribal energy program guarantee is gone, right? We have billions that are coming, but how can we structure this in order to unlock private capital and not just have it be allocated and sitting on the sidelines?
You think full ecosystem and you think about who benefits, and when you create a structure that benefits everybody, then you hit scale.
I think it's really rests on accountability and our ability here to create an accountability model that's both top down but bottom up. And I think that those investments in systems reform or change that highlight to folks where they are, whether it be community development or community-based organizations or other nonprofits, how they're connected to this ecosystem, as you pointed out, Adam, and how the reciprocal nature on economic development can be enhanced. I think that accountability flow is key in better structuring.
Excellent. Thank you all for your brilliance and insights this morning. Round of applause.
All right, before everybody heads out, because Huva pushed a notification that lunch is served, I'm gonna try to really quickly walk you through what the rest of our afternoon is. I just wanted to also thank our wonderful panel. What an incredible panel. As I was sitting there, I was thinking to myself, man, I wish there was a way to lift up all of these nuggets. Then I remembered Twitter exists. So I hope you all were live tweeting as we went. I'll just try to capture some of the things that I heard about spread and scale of infrastructure development needing to start from a place of value, the importance of convening capacity, and then the fact that eligibility doesn't equal accessibility. And if we keep doing the status quo, we're not going to get to change. So real quick, before we head into lunch, I just wanted to cover what's next in the day. I promise the breakout sessions after this are going to be a lot more easy, maybe on the mind than yesterday. There'll be a little bit of a focus on some new and emerging and exciting funding opportunities tied to case studies to bring a little bit life to what some of these projects can look like. Those panels are going to be back to back, meaning they'll repeat. So you'll have an opportunity to listen to one and then hop into another one in the second session. And then following that, it really becomes a choose your own adventure from about 3 o'clock onward. We have a series of 3 different kind of optional panels you could join. But if that isn't doing it for you, open up your Huva app and go to the tab that says community. You can set up your own networking session anywhere in the building and the common space. For example, I'm going to set up a networking space for folks who are identifying as capacity builders. Let's map out where we are in California and go from there. So that's, we'll be reconvening back in this room around 4:30 for a closeout of the conference. Other than that, go enjoy lunch. Thanks so much.